All right. Thank you, Matt, for that introduction. Hi, folks. My name is Ashish Thusoo. I am the CEO and co-founder of a company called Qubole, which essentially builds a data platform for the cloud. We've been doing that for a while. And today I'm basically going to be talking about how cloud can enable companies to become more successful with big data and make big data more accessible enterprise-wide. So that's really the purpose of my talk here. But before I jump into that, let me just start with a little bit of a primer of what changed in the world that led to the emergence of big data. And if I was to pick one thing, and the one thing that really changed was the nature of data itself. So when we are back in the back in the 90s, most of the data that was collected for analysis was transactional data. This was data which was generated by business processes, business processes, or you filling out a form of on a system or something like that. But with the emergence of with the proliferation of devices, with the proliferation of sensors, with the proliferation of social media and many such things, essentially we are now living in an age where interaction data is what has become very very important for companies to harness in order to get insights. And that is a fundamental change that has happened in the last decade. The last decade itself has been around this interaction data being collected by companies and so on and so forth. And this interaction data is fundamentally of a different nature. Not only in cases, of course, it's voluminous, travels, we talk about the 3 V's and 4 V's of data and so on and so forth. But apart from being voluminous, it is also, many times it exhibits characteristics of being unstructured or semi-structured in nature. So that is one thing that has been a change in the last decade or so. And in addition to that, what has also happened is that more and more companies are trying to, the type of analytics that they want to do is becoming much more sophisticated. The past generation or the previous generation analytic systems were primarily what we call, the mainstream analytic systems I'm talking about. You could find, predictive stuff in niches and stuff like that. But more mainstream analytic systems were very descriptive. They would describe what has happened. And now with the proliferation of data, with more sophistication coming in around how to use data, companies are trying to figure out how they can use that data to not just describe what has happened, but also to predict and prescribe how things can be done better. And that is a general trend. So big data, essentially the emergence of these new systems, we hear about systems like Hadoop, Spark, Hive, and so on and so forth. A lot of emergence of these systems has been driven by the convergence of these two things, these two changes. The analytics becoming more sophisticated, as well as large troves of data now being available, which is generated through interactions, through interactions between human beings, interaction between machines, sensor data, and so on and so forth. Now, it is, it's also, there have been a lot of studies. Why is big data important? Why is data important in the first place? There are a lot of studies that suggest that, and this should not come as a whole lot of a surprise to the people in this room, that suggests that companies that employ data have, eventually have a competitive advantage over their competition, and from various different metrics of performance. So it is, now using data, using big data to, further optimize and run your business is not just it should not be treated as an option. It is almost a requirement in this day and age, where if you don't do that, you essentially get left behind. Competition moves much more ahead of you. So, in a nutshell, these technologies are now starting to move from being, things which are optional, things which are more experimental, towards a situation where if you are not adopting these technologies, you are essentially losing some competitive advantage. And so what is the what is the architecture, or what is the if you are a company today and you are a data-driven, you're an aspiring data-driven company, what is it that you want to really enable in this environment? How do you want to approach that? So before I started Qubole, I was at Facebook and I ran the team that built out the infrastructure there. And there I really got the front row seat of figuring out what aspiring data-driven organization should do in order to really make data accessible and make it much more self-service and so on and so forth. In my tenure at Facebook, that lasted about 4 years, a lot of focus was around making these systems, the data infrastructure and the big data systems accessible to a to various different user personas within Facebook. It was not okay to just have those systems be used by the developers or the engineers, but we really strove for putting that data out or building systems in such a way which are much more self-service, so people could, from other functions, could use this data. And the impacts, they were very transformational. They were very profound impacts. Data found its way into the day-to-day conversation. Data was the driver behind a lot of strategic things, strategic initiatives at Facebook, whether they were growing the network to 1 billion users, or whether it was monetization and many other use cases. So that really crystallized in my mind this picture of what data can do if you open it up, what a self-service data infrastructure can do if you really make it available broadly in an enterprise. However, I regularly run across companies who are still struggling with big data, and building that out. And the picture that is emergent there is that most companies today have a very broken architecture as far as data back office is concerned. So instead of the previous picture where the infrastructure is the center, it's self-service, and all the various teams are accessing this self-service infrastructure to get their analysis and do their data processing and stuff. What is most common in most companies is that they end up between the infrastructure and the users, the company ends up putting a team in place, which is called the data team. And more often than not, this data team eventually becomes a bottleneck. It sort of delays the availability of data and what people can do with that data. Most companies struggle with this, and most companies reach this sort of equilibrium state of this infrastructure, which is bottlenecked on the data team, primarily because of many reasons. And some of the important reasons are the infrastructure many times is very static, very inflexible, and companies are afraid of opening up that infrastructure because then if everybody's working on that infrastructure, maybe the infrastructure doesn't stay up. There is a general lack of self-service tools many times, which is working with those with this infrastructure. There is a lack of skill sets that are needed to run and operate this infrastructure, because remember, these are new generation technologies which are still evolving and evolving at a very rapid pace. Because of all of these different reasons, the data back offices of most companies revert to that state where the data team becomes the bottleneck and everybody else has to run to these experts in order to access this infrastructure. So how can we change this picture? To me, the cloud has been the answer for changing this picture. Cloud, now in this day and age, we are living in a time when infrastructure is shifting rapidly from on-premise traditional data centers towards the cloud. And cloud provides capabilities where some of these impediments can be taken away, and the adoption of big data and the accessibility of big data can be made that much more simple for any enterprise. And one of the big facets there is that in the cloud you can have pre-aggregated infrastructure. You don't have to really reinvent the wheel where you are putting together these dozens of open source systems to come up with a data platform. In the cloud, things are turnkey. So while if you are going with a traditional approach of standing this up in your data centers, I think some of the estimates are it takes between 6 to 18 months to get to production. Cloud is production from day one. All that is needed is the data to be there, and then you can really use the power of these technologies. The other thing around the cloud is that for the first time we have infrastructure where compute and storage has been converted into an API. And that has a profound impact in how you can operationalize these systems. So for the first time now, we have a substrate where you can create the infrastructure to fit the analysis and the needs of the data users, as opposed to in the past where you had a fixed infrastructure and every analysis or every need of the data user had to fit into that infrastructure. So if you did not have enough of that infrastructure, the proper infrastructure, well, guess what? You are out of luck, and you have to wait for the infrastructure to be upgraded and so on and so forth. So the fact that the cloud changes infrastructure, especially compute and storage, into APIs allows cloud data platforms to deploy technologies like auto-scaling or self-managing infrastructure, where infrastructure adapts to workloads. And fundamentally, and that's a fundamental shift between what cloud technologies can do and how they can really use the cloud to further simplify the operations of this platform versus traditional on-prem approaches where you have got fixed amount of infrastructure and you have to fit everything in it. Qubole, for example, in Qubole, we regularly have, with our auto-scaling algorithms, we regularly scale up clusters to 36 times the size of the minimum clusters on an average customer. And that mindset itself brings, it's a shift in the mindset into how you think about the cloud technology impacting of using the cloud technology, but it also has tremendous benefits when it comes to being able to support wider, larger populations of users with very few administrators because of all this automation and all this orchestration which is built to the platform. It also has tremendous benefits when it comes to performance, when it comes to utilization and cost management of the infrastructure that you are spinning. So that is another aspect of the cloud that if you bring it into big data by simplifying operations, it can really enable you to adopt these technologies much faster. However, along with this automation, it is also very important to marry this infrastructure, this data platform with having self-service interfaces. And with a SaaS approach, with a software as a service approach, you can have turnkey self-service workbenches for whether you're a data scientist or a data analyst and so on and so forth. And if you marry that approach with an automated infrastructure, you really start getting to that vision where you can open up this data infrastructure to a lot of users and still maintain a very small operational footprint, which is what many companies struggle with. And you can really take down some of these impediments around adoption of big data and so on and so forth. Again, one question that always comes up is cloud secure. What about, yes, great, you have opened up the infrastructure to everyone, but I also want to maintain some amount of control. I also want to maintain some amount of visibility as to what is there in the cloud, and I also want to maintain an amount of security there. Cloud technologies over the years have evolved to a degree where there are a lot of options around encryption, around virtual private clouds and stuff that is available for security. There are audit trails that are available which can enable a proper data platform to take some of these audit trails and really expose that level of control and that level of visibility to the data team. And when you combine all of these things together, you essentially start getting to a place where the data team, instead of becoming a bottleneck, starts to become, can become a key enabler of this transformation where a self-service platform which is automatically orchestrated in the cloud can enable the company to use a lot of data and open it up to a lot of users. A while back, I used to get a lot of around cloud security and compliance. I used to get a lot of questions around, hey, our data has to reside in a certain jurisdiction, and there are certain country rules and stuff like that and regulations that the data cannot leave certain boundaries. Guess what? The cloud providers themselves, by opening up different regions in these different jurisdictions, give you a very broad geographical reach to address those issues. And that is another way of attacking some of these compliance issues. So net and net, a cloud data platform which uses some of these benefits of the cloud can really achieve the ubiquity of opening up data to a lot of users in the enterprise. We have a lot of customers in Qubole where we have been able to affect the transformation because of those reasons, by bringing the value of the cloud to big data and across various different workloads. For example, we process around 500 petabytes of data every month across workloads ranging from mundane ETL workloads to more complex machine learning workloads to ad hoc analysis and so on and so forth. So given that, I would just want to close this by reiterating again that really cloud-based big data platforms are transformative in making big data accessible at an enterprise scale, and they enable enterprises to become that much more successful with big data in a very agile, easy, and a failure-proof way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if you can join me for a minute. So just one question from me, and then I'll open up to people. So you've been the, what's the expression, the flag bearer of the big data in the cloud for a while now.
Yeah, 5 years now.
5 years,
yeah.
Yes. And I know you guys have been doing really well, but so there's the pitch. And then there's the reality of a lot of companies, especially Fortune 1000, that are saying, my data will never go to the cloud.
Yeah.
Where are we in the arc?
So I think there has been a marked change in the last 5 years. When we started the company first, we would regularly go, end up into companies which would say there were two, the companies would either fall in a category of, hey, we have adopted cloud wholesale, or as you are saying, we're not going to touch the cloud even with a long pole. We see a lot of hybrid environments now. Even in these Fortune 1000 companies, we see that cloud deployments are taking hold. And part of the reason that has happened is because one of the big reasons for not using the cloud at that time was security. And the cloud providers, their roadmaps have addressed security over the last 2-3 years in a very, very big way. Not just security, but even compliance and stuff like that. So those objections are going away. And then when you compare those objections with the amount of agility that you gain by using a cloud platform, the fact that you can shift, your workloads change and you can shift your infrastructure and things like that, it's starting to dawn a lot on these companies that they are actually losing competitive advantage if they're not going to use the cloud. And so with the result, I think last year in reInvent, right, Capital One was up on the stage saying that, we're going to shut down our data centers, move things to the cloud. So I think there's a marked shift, and I think that shift is just accelerating with every passing quarter, and we are seeing that in the market.
I think we have one mic for now.
So apart from security, I'm wondering what other factors make companies nervous about going to the cloud, and I'm specifically wondering if in your experience things like vendor lock-in, not wanting to get committed to one platform, then you're unable to move later, you're afraid the vendor is going to arbitrarily raise prices, real commercial stuff like that.
Yeah.
Is that a factor in your experience?
So I think, so for a long time there has been traditionally one cloud vendor, which is AWS. And while some of these bigger Fortune companies are afraid of vendor lock-in, what is also happening in the cloud market is other providers are coming up. So that keeps everybody honest. From the price perspective, actually the cloud pricing has gone down over the last 3-4 years because competition has come in. Azure is there, Google is there. We have some of the other ones are much earlier in their evolution. So because of the competition, I think things are being kept honest. But there is certainly a sentiment around, especially the Fortune companies, which around vendor lock-in and things like that. The way they are trying to deal with that is we have started to see in the press mentions of a company using 2 clouds and stuff like that, but it's not very wholesale right now. But that thought process is certainly there. And for Qubole, one of the things that they ask us is that how do you ensure that there is no vendor lock-in? And for us, it becomes a matter of strength because we are cloud agnostic. We can run on AWS, we can run on Azure, and so on and so forth. So I think as a breed of software that makes being cloud agnostic a central point of the theme emerges, I think some of those vendor lock-in issues will start to go away. Though there is always some bit of lock-in when you are using a provider. But I think the ecosystem itself is evolving with multiple providers, emerging. That will keep everybody honest around that. Yeah, sure.
There.
Thank you for your presentation. I have one question. I'm curious, in your opinion, what has more influence on big data? Technical side, such as discovering Internet of Things and so on, or organization structure like you described, or that data became interconnected, so different departments interested in data from other departments. Thank you.
So it is a bit of both. It's very well known in data, amongst, I think, bunch people who have dealt with data here. It's very well known that the best, you actually improve the quality of insights if you combine data sets about the same entity from independent data sources. So, which means that you want to fight against silification of data. You want to make sure that if one department in your company has a certain data set, you want to make sure that it gets correlated with the data set about the same entity in a separate department and things like that. So organizationally, that is important to solve. And if you move to a self-service vision, it's sort of, you need technology to solve that also. Organization, there, if for example, you don't have an infrastructure that can support that, or you don't have an infrastructure that can make things, self-service, or you don't have an infrastructure that can scale to that end, then, what happens is silification, because of technology. But if you have solved the technology problem, once you solve the technology problem, I think it also becomes very important for companies to embrace this idea that, let's put all the data sets together at one place. Let's create the organization in such a way. This whole concept of data lakes has become very popular. It's essentially that concept where you're putting all these data sets together because you can derive more insights by correlating these independent data sets and get that advantage. So I think both of the things are important. Again, many transformational changes involve people, processes, and technology, and you can't just leave out, just say one is more important than the other. If you have, if anything is missing in that, in that trio, then essentially you won't get to that transformation.
Great. On that note, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thanks, Matt.